Hello, welcome to the video for what is the material texture sample. I've gone ahead, create a quick example. We'll go ahead and cover what the texture sample is. Now the texture sample node is one of the primary nodes for when you are working with materials, so you're going to see it a lot. You can create one simply by holding down the T key on your keyboard and clicking in your material graph, or you can drag it out of the right-click menu or in your palette. So here is a texture sample node. It has some material expression properties and then some texture-based properties here along with a description. We're going to cover this bottom part first and then go into the more complicated stuff secondary. So by default, when you bring in a texture, it has nothing attached to it. If we go ahead and search through our samples here, we'll go ahead and pull up our brick diffuse texture. Once we do that, by default, you're going to notice nothing happens up here because we haven't actually assigned this to our input on our main material. So when you create a texture, if you notice, by default, this is going to show color because my material, if I was to pull it up, is using a color for the texture itself. If I was to pull up another texture, for example, let's pull in another one, and let's change this to my normal map. You're going to notice the sampler type automatically changes to normal. So that is one of the first things to learn here. The sampler type determines what type of image is being sampled by the texture sampler. By default, assuming you pull in a texture this way, it's going to go ahead and set it up properly. Now it may come in incorrectly based on your import settings. So if it does, you can go ahead and just change it. Or for example, let's say I had this as a normal, and then I changed it to a diffuse map. It may not properly change the sampler type. You may have to adjust it normally. The nice thing is Unreal Engine will let you know if there's an issue. So if I change this to normal, for example, and try to apply it, it's going to let me know right now there's no issue because this could be used as a normal map. But if I was to take this color one and change it to normal and hit apply, it's going to let me know that it can't be used as a normal once I plug it into my base color. See right here? Sampler type is normal, should be color for this texture, because the base color is expecting a color input sampler type. So if we switch that back, we go ahead and switch this back to normal. We'll change this to our normal, and we'll plug it into our normal. We now actually have a texture where you can see the output. So your texture sampler is going to be your primary input for your main material itself. Now, your next option is going to be is default mesh paint texture. If this material is used for mesh paint texturing, if you're using the painting options, you can set this material inside of it to be your default texture when you are painting. So if you click this checkbox, it's going to go ahead and add an extra instruction, and it will be your default texture when you are painting. You'll know if you need it if you are doing texture painting. Underneath this, we have description, which is pretty simple. You can just type here. It'll add a little description at the top, and you're going to find all your nodes have a descriptor, so it's not really too much of an issue there. Our next options are going to be our top ones, which are our texture sample expressions. Now, for the most part, if you don't know what you're doing or you don't see any problems with your texture, you can go ahead and leave these alone. These change the MIP values. Basically, as you get farther away from the screen, your texture itself, if we were to pull this up, is going to change in size. My texture right here is 2048 by 2048, a 2K texture. It has 12 MIP values. If I was to change this right here to a higher number, you're going to notice our texture itself here is going to change in terms of its max in-game size. That's basically going to limit the amount of memory the texture uses, as well as the quality, because of course it's smaller, it's going to be less quality. So by default, it's going to use the computed Mipmap level based on your anisotropic filtering and a few other things. It's okay to leave this as default. But if you need to change it for any reason, you would go ahead and use these values here. You have MIP level, like I said, by default, this is going to use the automatic settings. If you want to force it, for example, maybe you want this one to be a lower resolution material. You can click on MIP level. You'll now have a new input for level. If you simply hook in a node there and set its value, 0 being the default high resolution, as you can see here, higher numbers 1, 2, 3 being lower resolution. So if we change this to 4, for example, and let it recompile, it'll be a lower resolution appearance. Now, it's not too much of an issue when you have other normal maps and things like that. You may be able to get away with it. So that is how you can force a level for your MIP value. And the next option is MIP bias. It's very similar to our MIP level, but it's simply going to be the biases computed MIP level. It's relative to the computed level. So for example, if you have it set to a different one, this will be relative to it. Basically, let's unhook our normal here, and we can easier see our difference. So as you can see, without our normal, it's much lower resolution because we've gone ahead and changed this up to a higher bias value. If we were to remove that and go back to our normal full resolution, you can see a much cleaner detail. But when we hook up our normal, we've got a nice little detailed model here. And even if we lower our bias, it still looks decent because we have our normal in there giving us a little bit of extra detail. So it's a nice way of still lowering the memory usage because we're using a lower texture sample, but you can still get something decent out of it as needed. So this is one of those things where you'll adjust as needed. By default, leave it alone. The next one is going to be our derivative, which is basically you have your DDX and your DDY, which is your computed values for the MIP bias. This is a very advanced thing. You only want to mess with this if you know what you're doing. And basically, as an example here, if I was to plug my texture coordinate node in here, plug in a modified DDX and DDY in here, and I go ahead and hit apply, you're going to see we have details, which is better than our other biased version, but it's still flat. It doesn't have all of the exact. If we were to go ahead and unhook these and apply, you're going to get an error because this needs them. If we were to actually plug in our direct values, this is not our multiplied values, for example, and hit apply, you're going to see your higher resolution original. The issue here, though, is if you do not know what you're doing, if you are not doing this for a purpose, don't do it. If you look down here, you'll see 95 instructions for the static lighting, 63 for dynamic lighting. If we were to unhook this, set it back to our default, and go ahead and run it, you're going to notice our instructions down here, let me unhook this, are going to be significantly less. That's because it doesn't have to manually compute these values. It can do it much faster. So Unreal recommends leave your texture sampler MIP values alone unless you have a specific issue. Like, for example, you need it to have a specific filtering. Therefore, you can use these MIP values. So that's what those are there. Down here, we have our clamping for our sampler source itself. So you have from the texture asset, which is by default. I actually forgot to set this back. And this will set the clamping based on how this texture is set up itself. Underneath that, we have the different options for wrapping for the clamping and wrapping for how it's sampled and clamping for how it's sampled. Basically, if you need to change the way the sampler is sampled, you can change it here to wrapping, clamping, or from the texture asset. One of the keys here is if you are using a lot of textures inside of your sampler, you may start running into issues. If you notice down here, it says texture samplers 416. This will allow you to share samplers with other textures and either use wrapping for the source or clamping for the source. If you have a texture, if you have a material that needs a lot of textures. I know that was kind of weird, but basically, let me go and hook these up. Let me set this one to texture sampler and set this one to texture sampler. We'll go and apply this, and we'll show it in use. So down here, we're going to see, once it compiles, we are using 5 of our 16 texture samplers. Now we could hook a texture into our emissive color, our roughness, our specular, our metallic. You could technically hook them into here so that way you have masked textures. We could put a texture into our opacity and our opacity mask. We could be using a texture sampler for things like our ambient occlusion. So at some point in time, you're going to start having issues in terms of how many textures are being used in this material. Now, if we were to take this texture and plug this into our ambient occlusion, for example, before we had 5 of 16 samplers. Right now, you're going to see, when it's done, 5 of 16 samplers. Because we are not using any more unique textures. We're still using just these ones. Now, the problem comes in if we added in more unique ones. Maybe you wanted a grime texture that you want to multiply against your roughness texture. Or a landscape where you have a texture for mud and then one for rocks and then one for a water edge and a grass edge. As it gets more and more complex, you're going to run out of texture samplers. If you have that issue, you can go and just change it to one of the shared values. And what it's going to do is it's going to use the same sampler source for the texture. And that's going to allow you to get over your 16 texture sampler issue. So that's basically a more advanced option if you start running into needing more than 16 unique textures in your material. A little bit long-winded, but it's an advanced option. Underneath that, we have constant coordinate. This is only used if the coordinates are hooked up, which are going to be our UV sections here. Under that, we have constant MIP value. Again, this is only used if MIP value is not hooked up. So if we were to switch this back over to our MIP level, you're going to find that this is no longer going to do anything. Now, in terms of what it said, constant coordinate, your textures, and I should have covered this earlier, but your textures have inputs, which is right here, and this is based on the actual MIP value mode. If you notice, it's UV, UV level, UV bias, UV, DDX, and DDY. Your UV is your texture coordinate input for this texture sample, and that'll be covered in a different node. But basically, you can take your UV input, and then you can modify your texture itself, and then have a different output. Your outputs are going to be everything, which is your R, G, B, and A channel, or you can use the individual red, green, blue, or alpha channels. So for example, if you had a masked texture, in this case, we have this one right here, and this is a masked texture. Basically, the red, green, and blue are all unique textures. If we were to view this, you're going to see your red is this. Maybe it's used for your roughness mask. Your green is this one. Maybe this is your ambient occlusion. Your blue is this one. Maybe this is a more detailed grime mask. And then your alpha is nothing in this case because it's a solid texture. So if you needed an individual one, you would just pull out of the individual node. Maybe we want this for ambient occlusion. And you're going to find that basically it's only going to output just the green mask and into our ambient occlusion. So these are your individual outputs of your texture sample node. So that's it. That will cover our texture sample. I know it rambled a little bit in the middle there, but there's some complex uses of your texture sample based on what you intend on doing. For the most part, you can just simply use the texture sample as is, input your texture, hook it up to your input on your main material, and that's all you're going to need to do. The extra options are for tweaking. If you get to the point where you're going to need to use them, you'll know what you're going to need to use them for. The texture sample node is primarily just used to get a texture into your material so you can do something with it. So that's it. That is our texture sample node. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below.